Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank Arctic Summer College for your kind invitation to present today. And it's a great honor to present once more and to give you an update on progress following my presentation last year. And again, my message in this talk is a simple one, as it was last year, and that hard work is required to achieve it. We must work together in order to achieve best practice, which will help to implement the polar code effectively and create the correct behavioral atmosphere for all polar operations. I've been involved in the, Catherine, I'm trying to change my slides and it's not working.
I'll change it for you then.
Have I got control now or not? Yes, I do. Okay. Okay, excellent. 1 second now, I need to go back to the last one. Okay. So I've been involved in the development of the Polar Code, and it's important for everyone to understand that it's coming into force by way of an amendment to 3 existing conventions: the environmental aspects under the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, the crew certification aspects under the Watchkeeping Convention, and the safety aspects under SOLAS, the Safety of Life at Sea Convention. Under the Polar Code, in brief, it's necessary for operators to hold a Polar Waters Operation Manual that explains they have a plan to deal with the worst case scenario in the conditions that may be encountered, and they must demonstrate search and rescue capability, including a total loss of the vessel, that equipment and crew are fit for purpose in the difficult conditions, and that they must make reference to an ice regime methodology that shows how their ship will deal with the ice in the area that is being contemplated. And that methodology must be explained in their Polar Ship Certificate, which will be issued by the flag state where their ship is registered. And this methodology system has only just been developed, and I'm representing the International Union of Marine Insurance in that process. By way of background, I have in the last few years been working closely with the insurance industry in relation to international regulation in the marine and offshore industry, working with Lloyd's on their Arctic report in 2012, their wreck removal report in 2013 following the loss of the Costa Concordia, and also their drilling in extreme environments report following the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2010. And in February 2014, at the suggestion of Transport Canada, I presented at IMO headquarters on the operationalizing of the Polar Code and some of the concerns of the insurance industry at that point. And it was clear, in the absence of regulation, that best standard practices must be achieved in order to protect industry and the huge investments involved. And it's always the insurance industry's focus to try and prevent accidents and pollution, but to also create certainty in liability regimes when incidents do occur. And next slide, please, Catherine. The insurance industry really became focused on the polar regions following the concerns over Deepwater Horizon, where BP incurred record criminal fines in US history, but also huge economic loss due to reputational damage and criminal charges, and the company really is still struggling to recover, and the disaster will not go away for BP and BP's employees. Next slide. 1 former senior executive and 2 oil well supervisors spent 6 years awaiting trial, but those charges have finally only just been dropped. And that's a tough place to be for those men. It's never anyone's intention to go to work, be in the middle of a horrendous disaster, and then to be held account to it for those who have died, or to be responsible for it in the boardroom. But that's the reality if it goes wrong. And next slide, please. Whilst all this has been going on, and particularly in 2012 when oil prices were never so high, vessels used the Northern Sea Route for cargo transport between Europe and Asia as well. And this increased the intention of the insurance industry, as we can see. Well, first of all, in September 2013, the Nordic Orion became the first bulk cargo vessel to go through the Northwest Passage, and she was followed in September 2014 by FedNav's Nordvik, pictured here, being the first bulk cargo vessel to go unassisted without icebreaker assistance. Next slide, please. And at the same time, the insurance industry noted the record ice loss in the Arctic, which was a key factor in these developments, and the learned participants in this call will be aware that there's a record ice year on schedule at the moment in 2016, but it looks like it will tail off to be slightly below the record ice melt of 2012. And what was clear as we embarked on this new phase in the Arctic in the shadow of the Gulf of Mexico oil spill is that there was a fundamental requirement for voluntary cooperation in standards in order to protect everyone's best interests. And this was emphasized by the reviews in regulation following the Deepwater Horizon disaster, which demonstrated their inadequacies. Next slide. The disaster killed 11 people and spilled 4.9 million barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And next slide. It's important to remember that this was a human tragedy, and this slide remembers those who lost their life in the incident, and that's the reality of the issues that we are dealing with. Next slide. The conclusion of the US Commission was damning, and it was clear that fundamental changes were required. It said this disaster was almost the inevitable result of years of industry and government complacency and lack of attention to safety, and which was later confirmed in the US Coast Guard Agency's report, and it resulted in the decoupling of the regulator and the health and safety executive, where it stated there was a clear conflict of interest and that a safety case approach rather than a prescriptive approach should prevail. Next slide. Following the Piper Alpha disaster in the UK in 1988, this safety case recommendation and decoupling recommendation in Lord Cullen's report, along with his other 105 recommendations, were all implemented in the UK. And next slide. Similarly, following the sad accident of the Alexander Kyland in Norway, Norway implemented a stringent safety case regime drawing on some of these recommendations, resulting in Norway's leading regulatory regime today. And next slide, please, Catherine. After Deepwater Horizon, many reviews took place around the world, and it was clear that human error, safety culture, risk assessment, communication, control of contractors are always highlighted as a problem, and the root causes of accidents are usually the same, and that the regulatory regimes across the globe are fundamentally different and sometimes deeply flawed. And that is not surprising when international conventions fail to be ratified, such as the Convention on Pollution from Fixed Structures, which has been lying on government shelves, gathering dust since 1977, as has the Torre-Molinos Convention for fishing boat safety, which shamefully has only been ratified by 4 countries, Norway, Iceland, the Netherlands and South Africa. And it is for that reason that we must work together to get it right. And in a way, the Polar Code is an extraordinary achievement by the IMO and the world's delegations when put in this context. Next slide, please. Given these concerns, a few years ago, in September 2011, I had organized a joint conference with Lloyd's of London focusing on the global challenges for the London insurance market and oil contractors and operators responding to a major offshore energy disaster in 5 different jurisdictions: the UK, Australia, Brazil, the US and Russia. And the lack of uniformity in preventing such accidents and also in liability following such incidents was clear. And following this hypothetical disaster scenario conference, this led to work on Lloyd's Arctic report, which was launched in Oslo in April 2012. Next slide, please. The main points are highlighted here in blue. There are significant knowledge gaps with obvious problems in the Arctic. Charting data is an issue for mariners, and together with ice data, these are the critical issues for companies hoping to operate and ship assets and cargo. The environmental consequences of disasters are likely to be worse than other regions. In the absence of knowledge, incidents will occur, and the potential environmental consequences, difficulty and cost of cleanup may be significantly greater. Continued development of governance frameworks with reinforcements where possible are very important, and because of the major differences, as I've highlighted, between the regulatory regimes. And these frameworks to address this need to be put in place to enable sustainable development and to uphold the public interest. And risk management is fundamental, where the insurance industry would like to see companies operating in the Arctic implement robust risk management frameworks and processes that adopt best practice and contain worst-case scenarios, crisis response plans, and full-scale exercises. And there are many practical steps businesses can take to manage risks effectively, including investing in Arctic-specific technologies and implementing best-in-class operational safety standards. The Polar Code is a major step forward in filling this gap for insurers, but the code needed to be fit for purpose with clear guidelines. Next slide, please. And the problem for insurers in Arctic operations are that navigational limit provisions of hull and machinery policies, that's the insurance of the property of the vessel and its equipment, require the operator to inform the underwriter if they are going above 70 degrees north. And the concerns are obvious: extreme cold, reduced coverage of navigational aids, inaccurate charts, restricted visibility, inadequate weather reports and violent storms, and salvage facilities are almost non-existent. Next slide. Turning to protection and indemnity cover, that is the insurance for the consequences to third parties, i.e. the liability of something happening to the vessel, which is insured in first instance by protection and indemnity clubs, of which the vessel owner will be a member to spread the sometimes enormous liability for instances such as pictured here, the Costa Concordia. Although P&I clubs do not generally impose navigational limits, the club rules require them to be consulted if a voyage does not fall within a vessel's normal trading pattern. And of course, polar waters are not a normal trading pattern for most operators. And it's worth remembering that the hull loss for the Costa Concordia was $525 million, and that the liability cost to remove the wreck was $1.5 billion. So obviously the insurance industry weren't too happy about that, and if that were to happen in the Arctic, it would be a lot more costly. Next slide, please. And as the report confirmed, there is extreme difficulty in effecting a rescue or removal in polar waters. Most of the world's equipment is not in the high north, or indeed where the Polar Code is concerned, in the south. And oil pollution presents huge problems, and although a search and rescue agreement has been signed by the Arctic states, the impression is that not a huge amount of progress has been made in practical reality, and much work remains to be done. So when I presented, sorry, next slide please, the insurance industry also recognized the difficulty with political legitimacy, which was a factor in Shell's recent activity. And even if something does not or is not likely to happen, it is a very important consideration: corporate social responsibility. As well as doing the right thing, companies need to be seen to be doing the right thing and supporting best practice. Next slide. And human error will never go away. The Lloyd's wreck removal report told us that 75% of incidents are due to human error. And when we heard earlier today, there was an incident here in London that I was discussing in the Lloyd's market. Another major shipping incident has taken place, as I understand it, due to human error. So it's something that happens on a daily basis that we try and address, but it will never go away unless proper systems are in place. And so what could we do, going back a few years, about this situation in the absence of regulation as an insurance industry? Next slide, please. We decided to work behind the scenes with some Arctic Council governments following the Lloyd's report, and we pushed in an industry-led approach, a bottom-up approach, to create standards with ice captains. Helped by the Swedish government, we drafted the Arctic Marine Best Practice Declaration, which was backed by the International Union of Marine Insurance. And the insurance industry basically was not comfortable with insuring Arctic risk and was very nervous following the BP oil spill. And we also in industry had serious reservations at that point about the workability of the proposed Polar Code, and this push came to the attention of the IMO. And when I presented there in February 2014 on behalf of the insurance industry in conjunction with Transport Canada and the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I used some examples. Next slide, please. This incident, which you can see here, had the potential for catastrophic consequences: a ship without ice class and lots of people on board off the coast of Greenland. A nightmare for insurers, and such incidents do not inspire confidence within the insurance industry and show that clear regulation is required. Next slide, please. Additionally, in September 2013, the Nordvik entered ice waters on the Northern Sea Route and punctured her hull. She wasn't prepared for the ice conditions that were in play at the time, and it could have been an enormous environmental catastrophe, and she had to effect a ship-to-ship transfer and limp back to Murmansk. And next slide, please. And the academic Shikalski in the Antarctic in January 2014, where Australia incurred a $1.6 million bill, and that rescue also involved a US icebreaker and a Chinese icebreaker at substantial cost. And there was a panic that ensued unnecessarily because of the situation being whipped up and stirred up to be completely out of proportion. The ship was actually perfectly capable of dealing with the ice that she was in, which she became trapped in after a wind direction change, but there were no clear rules. The Australian authorities and others could not point to a Polar Waters Operation Manual, which is now a requirement, to say that the ship would be fine until the wind changes, but there were lots of media on board running out of food and beer, so an international panic ensued where the authorities were pressurized into acting. That cost states an awful lot of money unnecessarily that would have been well spent elsewhere. Next slide, please. At the IMO, we focused in particular on our understanding of the requirement for a polar ship certificate and a Polar Waters Operation Manual, the combination of which we said we understood was to give guidance for a range of planned and possible situations, now requirements under the Polar Code. We expressed our concern that it is left very much up to the owner, subject to satisfying the flag state, that the content is appropriate. And we explained there may not be a problem if a flag state has an understanding of ice. But if the benchmark rules in the Polar Code are not clear, what if it is not the case, and how will it be enforced by Arctic states that have no developed ice regime? We explained that on an Arctic and indeed polar-wide basis and in international waters this was an issue of concern, and that there was a knowledge gap that we could not get away from, which made it difficult for insurers to agree to operations above 70 degrees north. As only Canada and Russia had an ice regime system, we argued that a system should be established in order to have an effective application of the Polar Code, a single ice regime system in the whole Arctic and Antarctic, enabling a universal application and understanding of the rules. In order for the Polar Ship Certificate and Polar Waters Operation Manual to make sense, we argued that this is essential. The rules need to be understood, not just to see what is required more clearly, but to stop a third party bringing the house down for everyone. One mistake, and that is the end of the huge investments. Next slide, please. Otherwise, we explained insurers' automatic default at present was to turn risk away, and that this is impacting on operators who are operating with best practice, and there are many of them. Next slide, please. So what could we actively do about all of this to help the IMO as an industry? It was clear that in order to make relevance of the Polar Code and reduce risk on an Arctic-wide basis, to prepare for a range of planned and possible situations, we had to do more work to link everything together. Ice regime, the Polar Code, and ice class, and we needed to work hard to make that happen. It would not happen on its own. Essential to this was the gathering of knowledge in an integrated approach, and the research community working with industry, governments, and international regulators in a collaboration was seen as critically important. And so, next slide please, on the 11th of March in London in 2014 we assisted the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the support of the Arctic Council to organise this seminar about best practice in the Arctic with heavy input from the insurance market, including the protection and indemnity clubs, and with ice experts from across the Arctic and Antarctic, including the four masters of the Swedish icebreaker Odin and some of the members of the IMO delegations were also present. Next slide, please. And on the following day, this workshop took place in Lloyd's famous Adam Room about building of an Arctic-wide ice regime system, and strong industry recommendations were prepared and sent to the Arctic Council for the creation of a forum for best practice to achieve this. And I'd encourage you to look at those recommendations on the Swedish Polar Research Secretariat website. Of course, one of these recommendations was the ice regime system, which we then progressed at the IMO. There were other recommendations about collaboration for finding out what best practice is in meteorology, hydrography, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Mr. Sekimizu was present, the IMO's Secretary General until late last year, and he then attended the following Arctic Ambassadors meeting in Yellowknife in Canada in late March, which some of you may have been at. And that was the IMO's first official meeting with the Arctic Council prior to a Ship Arc conference that was organized with the IMO at the World Maritime University in Malmo in August last year. We were working a parallel approach, requesting that the Arctic Council establish the Forum for Best Practice to create an Arctic-wide ice regime based on the recommendations made at the London workshop to complement the Polar Code. And we were also pressing the IMO to enhance the draft Polar Code. We did not know if there was, or even think there was, time to include the ice regime system in the code. Next slide. But importantly, great leadership emerged, and following further discussion at IMO intersessional meetings about the draft Polar Code in 2014, the issue was discussed, and it was informally agreed that limitations for operating in ice demonstrating a systematic analysis of how the operator has arrived at his or her limitation should be included on the Polar Ship Certificate, and the full details should be included in the Polar Waters Operation Manual. However, then it had to be done formally in the IMO process and put to the world's delegations, all 170 or 171 of them, and I cannot emphasize enough the great involvement of all the Arctic states and commend all the Arctic states for their collaborative approach in conjunction with the Antarctic states. Next slide, please. A technical group involving most Arctic states was established and was set the goal of making recommendations in time for the Maritime Safety Committee meeting in November of 2014, and the group also linked in with an informal correspondence group which included all the Arctic states and most Antarctic states, and others such as myself were working in the background canvassing for the inclusion of some sort of an ice regime in the Polar Code. Next slide, please. The group brought together all the expertise regarding ice regime systems for operation in ice from the various jurisdictions across the Arctic. Next slide. The goal of the group was to develop a decision-making system that can be used for voyage planning in advance, and then on the bridge that uses the actual ice conditions, the ice class of the vessel and operational mode, with the very important element of correct crew on board, an ice navigator or a captain with sufficient experience. And a system was developed called POLARIS, Polar Operational Limit Assessment Risk Indexing System. Next slide. The aim of POLARIS is to provide a standard approach for the evaluation of risks to the ship in ice conditions expected to be encountered by providing a risk index in any geographical area that the ship is intending to travel. And this is a system similar to the established Canadian ice regime system for other ice areas of the Arctic or Antarctic, and effectively creates a polar ice regime, drawing also on the very experienced Finnish, Swedish, Baltic system and the Russian system, with heavy input from those jurisdictions. In brief, POLARIS uses a risk indexing outcome, RIO, which you can see on the slide, value to assess limitations for operation in ice. For each geographical area encountered, the risk indexing value assigned to the ship, its ice class, depending on its ice class, are used to determine an RIO that forms the basis of the decision to operate or limitation for operation. If the RIO is 0 or positive, the ship can proceed without speed limitation. Next slide, If the RAO is between -1 and -10, the ship can proceed with speed limitation. Such speed is calculated by Polaris. And if the RAO is below -10, the ship needs to demonstrate special circumstances. There are also provisions for ice areas broken by icebreakers, so icebreaker assistance is taken into account in the calculations. For example, the Crystal Serenity that's about to go through the Northwest Passage as icebreaker assistance, and I hope it is hypothetically applying the Polar Code rules. I'm sure that it is. The limitations determined by Polaris are to be included in the Polar Ship Certificate. Next slide. And of course, the lower the ice class and the harder the ice conditions, the likelihood of a no-go increases. And here are two brief examples. Next slide. This is a Category B vessel looking to go through the Northwest Passage in September 2014, and you can see the blue tracking of its voyage pattern through the archipelago. It's a no-go, as you can see from the red on the ice charts. Next slide. Whereas a Category A PC4 vessel can proceed. You can see in some stages at full speed, at normal speed, and then reduced speed in the yellow areas in the middle of the Northwest Passage. So finally, at the IMO, when they finalized the Polar Code, it was then formally agreed and inserted in the code that the operator must confirm on the Polar Ship Certificate that a recognized methodology for operational limitation has been used, and the method to be developed by the IMO, and a correspondence group was set up to finalize this new methodology, which will be in addition to existing methodologies such as the Canadian air system and the Russian system, but an operator must show that the area that they're going into is satisfied, obviously, with the system that they're carrying on board. Otherwise, if you turn up with the wrong system in Russia, then I suspect that you won't get clearance through their jurisdiction. Probably similar with Canada and every other jurisdiction, sensible jurisdiction. So the sensible thing is to ask the jurisdiction where the operator is traveling what system you would prefer, and then see if the flag state where your ship is registered will approve that system. Polaris seems to be the system that will be the generic system. And we've just reported to IMO Maritime Safety Committee 96 just a month ago, and the system is being approved in the IMO guidelines. Next slide, please. Nothing happens without extracurricular and voluntary effort and leadership, and in this instance the insurance industry has worked together with international regulators, with governments, operators and the research community to make a significant difference. And in addition to education about the Polar Code, however, which is critical at the moment, there is a lot of other work to do. As we know, other areas require regulation. The non-SOLAS vessels in polar regions, such as fishing vessels, as demonstrated by this awful tragedy in April of last year, and pollution from fixed structures. Next slide, please. And we still very much believe that there should be a forum for best practice in the Arctic Council, as suggested in the original conference with the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in London in 2014, to focus on the inputs that will determine the worst case scenario that may occur in the Polar Waters Operation Manual: hydrographic data, meteorology, crew training, communication and ice charting. And these issues, were we to get the best standards, would equate to navigational safety, which is a priority under the US Arctic Council chairmanship. And we believe that that work must continue in parallel to the Polar Code. The recommendations that we made after the Swedish seminar came to the attention of the Arctic Council, in particular, for those of you who are familiar with it, the protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, and I was formally asked to present this proposal to the Arctic Council at their PAIM meeting in February in Stockholm. And I explained that the Swedish seminar in London and that the results in relation to the ice regime system Polaris that we managed to get into the Polar Code are an example of what a forum can achieve, which will not only help to educate everyone about the Polar Code, but also really focus on the tools to make it work. Best practice in crew training, hydrography, meteorology, communication, and ice charting. And this will help to educate all the decision makers in the stages of the process: operators, flag states, insurers, financial institutions, and port state control. Next slide, please. I explained in Stockholm that the participants that we suggest are representatives from the list here on this slide, and I'll provide this to everyone afterwards. And also, next slide, please, Catherine. A further list. Back one. A further list here. I had already had discussions with most of these participants prior to going to PAIM in Stockholm, who are willing to contribute, and PAIM unanimously backed this proposal and to do further work on it, and have asked me to work with their expert shipping group to build this forum and present the final version at their next meeting in the state of Maine in September. And the proposal will then be recommended to the senior Arctic ambassadors, hopefully if it's finalized in Maine, from each Arctic state, with a recommendation to each country's Minister for State that it be formally declared, hopefully at the handover of the Arctic Council chairmanship from the US to Finland in April 2017. That's the aim, giving the US a defined, achievable under their Arctic Council chairmanship. And just finally, when I was at the PAIM meeting, I noted that the International Ice Charting Working Group had some time ago given a presentation to PAIM. However, we need to know on a continual basis where the International Ice Charting Working Group, just using it as an example and its information, is as they develop better standards, not a presentation that was given 2 years ago that everyone found interesting, but now no one knows what the position is. If we had them participate in this forum, they would automatically update a portal with the best standards, and everyone would know where to go to get the best information, and so on a continual basis. Each participant would be responsible for gathering the latest developments in their area of expertise on a cross-jurisdictional basis, and for updating the forum, which would meet once a year, probably around an IMO meeting in London, when many of the experts would be here anyway. We need to know what the best information is at any point in time, and currently that knowledge is lacking in the various decision-making stages of the process: operators, flag state, insurers, financiers, and port state control. Put simply, in my experience and speaking to others, people do not know where to get reliable information. Next slide, please. And if we can do this on a practical business level with such a development, if we get it right, we believe that it is possible to have happy insurers who will insure Arctic operations that are based on a sustainable approach to Arctic development, so that everyone benefits. And those who are operating correctly can go about their business, and those who are not are stopped by a behavioral atmosphere that is understood. And my final slide, please, Catherine. And most importantly, a proper implementation of the Polar Code, which will only happen if we make it happen, including everyone on this webinar this evening, as a collective, will protect some people and the environment from the usual disasters. And by helping the IMO and national governments, we perhaps might create the right behavioral atmosphere to deal with the areas outside the Polar Code. And who knows, we might get national governments to step up to the mark and ratify some of the conventions that are gathering dust on government shelves, which I referred to earlier, such as the Torre-Molinos Convention for Fishing Boat Safety across the world. By showing leadership through the Arctic and Antarctic states at the IMO, ultimately, everywhere in the world, it is quite straightforward. Prevention is better than cure, and together we can make a difference. Thank you very much.